Hello everybody, I'm going to be talking about my book Breakfast with Socrates, and in doing so I'm going to be answering a few questions. The book was published in 2009 and I was writing it, I guess, for about 18 months, something like that before then. So yeah, 2007, 2008 is when I was writing it. How did the book change my life? Well, it's probably worth putting it in context a bit here, because the book did have an impact on my life. When I started writing it, I had a full-time job doing organizational consulting, basically, which is helping organizations on things like leadership and values, and sometimes how they organize themselves, a bit of coaching and so on. And I was working long hours. And I was keen actually to move away from that way of working, partly because of the long hours, partly because I preferred the idea of working on my own rather than in a business. And the idea of Breakfast with Socrates was partly to get myself to a place where I could begin to work independently by myself. And so I would write it in the evenings and early mornings before and after days at work, in order to produce something that would enable that movement away from being on the kind of hamster wheel or being in the rat race to being in a position where I could, have more of my own time to organize, basically. So that was the context. I guess the other thing to say is that, I'd written books before, academic books, because before the business job, I'd been an academic in Oxford, and in that time, I was writing academic books. There was one on Jacques Derrida, the philosopher, one on Sigmund Freud, of course, the psychoanalyst, and one on modern poetry. I was actually technically based in the English faculty in Oxford. And of course, I'm proud of those books in their different ways, but being academic and being pretty technical, they were really written only for a specialist audience. And having left the university, I didn't really see much point in writing another academic book. And the point of Breakfast with Socrates was then to really bridge between these two worlds that I had some experience of: the academic world, the world of ideas, the world of philosophy, and so on, and the everyday world, I suppose, the real world, I like to call it. And Breakfast with Socrates was written with the intention of taking complex ideas from the history of philosophy and so on and making them accessible to everyday people. And it fitted, therefore, in the category of popular philosophy, basically. So that was the idea. And popular philosophy at that time, 2009, had established itself as a section in the bookshop, basically. Partly due, I suppose, to people like Alain de Botton, and I began to do a little bit of work with him, or at least his organisation, the School of Life, as well, which was set up more or less to bring good ideas from the history of learning into people's everyday reality. So it sort of belonged in that context, I suppose. And that was the spirit behind it. Yeah, taking complex ideas and trying to present them in as simple a way as possible. Yeah, so is philosophy more accessible these days than it was then? I think in a couple of ways, yes. In one way, no. So first of all, it's more accessible in the literal sense, which is that largely because of the internet, there's just more and more available now, and it's available in pretty cheap form. I mean, you can get PDFs, for example, and not just of classics, but of a lot of work that's written by academics these days. And so in that sense, it's pretty accessible. And not just PDFs, but if you go on YouTube or other video platforms, you'll find plenty of philosophy, small p, presented, explained, talked about by both professional and non-professional philosophers. So in that sense, yeah, it's much more accessible in the sense that, one can access it. But then there's a question of whether philosophy itself, the content, the material, is any more accessible. And I think there are two opposite questions there. On the one hand, yes, because certain of those academics have had to, well, the unkind phrase is dumb down. The kind phrase is, make their work accessible by explaining it more clearly, more simply, with fewer jargon words and footnotes and so on. So, more accessible also in terms of content in a certain regard. But I think at the same time, what's happening in the university, as I understand it, and I'm no longer a jobbing academic, is that certainly in the world of philosophy, it's actually gone in the other direction. It's become more specialized. So those academics who are earning their keep from teaching and writing about philosophy seem to me to be becoming ever more technical in their work, and their research areas ever more tightly defined, and therefore kind of less and less accessible. So I suppose I would say there's, over and above the accessibility which is there simply by having stuff online, there's kind of a polarity that's emerged between more and more accessibility, thanks to philosophers, amateur and otherwise, who are explaining it, and platforms like festivals and so on, and salons and talks. And at the same time, this extreme, I won't call it obscuring of philosophy, because I don't think there's any willful obscurantism necessarily going on in the world of philosophy. But it seems to me there is certainly a branch, particularly of Anglo-American kind of classic philosophy, which perhaps is becoming less accessible for the majority of people. Yes, so Breakfast with Socrates is based around the structure of a single day, and that was partly to help with this idea of making it more accessible. So rather than talking about philosophy in the abstract, life, death, freedom of will, the existence of God, these classic subjects that philosophy is associated with, I thought, what if we took an ordinary day from waking up in the morning to going to sleep at night, and had a chapter for each kind of juncture in the day that would bring to bear certain philosophers, psychologists and other thinkers. So the opening chapter, waking up, I talk about the concept of waking up as a actually very philosophical concept, having your eyes wide open. Kant, the German philosopher, talks about waking up from our dogmatic slumbers. He thinks of philosophy itself as a kind of waking up. Anyway, there are 18 chapters: waking up, getting ready, traveling to work, being at work, and so on. And if I were to pick 2 or 3 chapters that I'd probably rewrite today, or certainly amend, the 3 I'd pick would be, first of all, being at work, because being at work is rather different than it was in 2008, 2009, largely because of the shifts to online working that happened during lockdown, but also because of much greater emphasis on inclusivity and diversity. And I think finally because the workplace is a much more, rightly so, much more sensitive to the needs of diverse communities. And with that, of course, the kind of shadow side of that is more and more cases coming to light of sexual harassment and so on. So the workplace is, it always has been, I suppose, but the workplace seems a much more fraught, contested, in a way more difficult place than it was before, and it's been split into online and offline worlds. So I think if I were going to rewrite the book, and certainly that chapter, I'd have to reflect that, because going to work has changed so much. The next one, I think I'd probably change. There's a chapter on shopping. In that chapter, when I wrote it, I made this distinction between shopping and buying. Buying would be when you go out and buy what you need, whereas shopping is about getting what you want. So shopping is a kind of gratuitous activity. And I'd revise that today, because although we have now endless YouTube and TikTok videos about unboxing and revealing your haul and so on, and consumerism seems to be probably no less rampant now than it was perhaps even more so. I think especially as wealth is shifting east, as we're told, towards Asia, where, and this may be too much of a generalization, but where it seems to me consumerism is just as embraced today as it has always been in the West. While all that is going on, I think there's a pretty strong countercurrent developing or intensifying of anti-consumerism. I mean, I think it's already, it's been there for a long time, but it's received a huge boost or fillip from the information we have now about the damage which consumerism and overconsumption is doing to the environment, particularly, of course, in terms of consuming things that are based on plastic or other oil products, as well as travel per se. So, there's a chapter in the book on booking a holiday, and I think, well, certainly in this part of the world, it would be more than a fleeting thought for most people to consider their carbon imprint these days when going on holiday. So I think that chapter, shopping, I would revise in the light of much greater awareness about the detrimental impacts of consumerism. What else would I change? I would maybe change, there's a chapter on watching TV in the book, chapter 13. And when I wrote that book, although, it was possible in 2009 to watch some stuff through the internet, it was nowhere near what it's become now with streaming services and so on. And one of the points I was making, I think, in the book originally, was that watching TV was a kind of family activity. The TV had become a focus for the living room. And if you look in the living rooms of most people, I think even today, the television is that focus. By the way, focus etymologically means a fireplace. So, the TV takes the place of the fireplace, literally, as the focus, the focal point of the household's attention. And of course that still exists up to a point. I'm sure there are still families and friends and so on, particularly in shared houses, who will gather around the television, certainly to watch big events like, a coronation or a big football match or something. So I think that does still happen. But at the same time, there's been a huge, deregulation, atomization of TV watching practices. So rather than being a social event, I think it's as much a solitary event as it ever was. And partly that's because you can stream whatever you want, whenever you want, and sit with a laptop in your bedroom, browsing forever, all sorts of programs. So I think probably I'd emphasize now the sort of antisocial rather than the social aspects of watching TV. And that for me seems to be, a pretty big shift. Any final thoughts? I mean, the spirit of Breakfast with Socrates from the author's point was, how to make ideas more simple and complex. But it's called Breakfast with Socrates for a reason. I mean, because it could have been breakfast with other philosophers, I suppose. And Socrates is famous for this phrase that the unexamined life is not worth living. His exhortation is for us not just to live our lives, but to reflect on our lives. Partly because if we just live our lives, we live our lives only once, as it were. Whereas if we live on them and reflect on them, we're kind of doubling our luck. We live our lives twice, because the process of reflection is one that gives us a lot, I think. And so regardless of whether one reads this book or not, that message from Socrates, I think, is as valid today as it was then, and will continue to be, of course, going forward. So yeah, the unexamined life is not worth living, so examine your life. Thank you for watching, and do subscribe to my